Hello and welcome to this video. This week I am looking at albums that will be 50 years old this year. On my first video that came out 2 days ago, I went through my 10 favourite jazz rock albums. Some of those albums were pretty proggy. They won't be making the list today. Today I'm going to be going through my 10 favourite progressive rock albums from 1974, and I'm going to be ranking them, and as it says in the title, they're my favourite ones. So there's loads I've missed. I know I've missed them. I know Mirage by Camel is not on the list, and it's a great progressive rock album, but it's not one of my favourites. I never had a copy of it when I was coming, in my progressive rock years, so I don't know that album. There's a whole ton of albums that, Queen 2, which is a pretty proggy album, and it's a fantastic album, will not be on this list. I'm aware of the albums, that Magnus Classic, I can't pronounce the title, that album is not on the list. There's a whole, do you get this? This is my favourite. Well, these are the ones I like, alright? They're the ones I like, okay? So, number 10, what have we got? Well, this is the band I don't talk enough about on this channel, and the reason is because I love them, but I've never listened to absolutely everything by them. For me, this progressive rock band made 3 incredible albums, right? The band is Focus, right? And those 3 albums, which I think are all you really need. I know people are going to hate this, but this is the way I see Focus. Moving Waves, and then what's the next album called? It's just a number, isn't it? Is it 4 or something? I can't remember. Whatever that double album is. And then this album, Hamburger Concerto. Now, Focus have this, unlike a lot of European progressive rock bands, they are far more influenced by the English progressive rock bands. There's a lot of integration of, classical structures and sort of the pastoral elements that you would associate with English progressive rock, but there's also a very strong sort of jazz rock influence on these albums. They have, of course, Jan Akkerman, who was one of the great guitarists of the 70s. As they start to develop their sounds over these 3 albums, I feel that they have, by Hamburger Concerto, have got to the peak of their powers. And this is an incredible album with that great sidelong epic. As you know, I make these videos off at the top of my head. I don't do any research. I go on what I know, especially when I'm doing a favourites album. I can't remember the titles of it. But this is an incredible album. From then on, I think this sort of internal conflicts with Focus start to have their effect, and the sort of quality starts to dip. Hamburger Concerto, although Moving Waves is often cited as their greatest albums, Hamburger Concerto could be seen as the apex of Focus, but also it represents what we're seeing in 1974 in terms of progressive rock, which is the cracks are starting to show. This whole progressive experiment that started with Sgt. Pepper and then was followed up by Pink Floyd, and then King Crimson and the Nice, and the momentum and the record sales, and the record companies suddenly go, wow, these albums are selling. They're selling a lot of records, so they push the money in, and people want to get more and more outlandish. And we see by 72, 73 that beautiful environment to create bonkers music that's going to, that millions of people are going to listen to. It's an incredible thing. It's starting to boil over. It's too big for the pot. 73, we see albums like Tales from Topographic Oceans. And by 74, I think in progressive rock, the cracks are starting to show. And the musicians know it themselves. Everybody's trying to outdo themselves. And once all you're trying to do is outdo each other, then where'd you go? Hamburger Concerto is an example of that. Once they've made this album, where do they go next? A triple album with 1 track on? This is the problem, I think. And the musicians start to see it. And the record company, I think, they begin to move on. And so this idea that 1977 is ground zero for progressive rock. I don't believe it's the case. It's 1974. And when I was thinking about this video, there's some incredible albums here, but you started to scrap around to find great masterpiece progressive rock albums. And all of them, there's a little bit of a, yeah, you know, as you feel that they've overreached themselves. At number 9, I have an example of a band they still haven't overreached themselves, but they're about to do it, and it's ELP with the live album Welcome Back My Friends to the Show That Never Ends. This, more than any album, which is a live album, probably represents ELP better than any other album. It's so outlandish. I think it's a triple album, isn't it? And it's got all the big tracks on there, all the sort of opulence that you expect from an ELP show, plus all the solo spots, you know, and you've got Carl Palmer there with his shirt off, ringing his bell like that on a chain and all that sort of stuff. This really represents, for me, the point where it's going too far, but they're still managing to pull it off. Where is the ELP going to go from here? Works? Love Beach? You know, this is the peak. 74 is the peak of ELP. Here we have it again, same as Focus. It's an album that really represents the mountaintop, and it might just be a bit too much for many people. And for me, it's a little bit too much. I've always had an issue with ELP. If you go back through my videos, I've explored it in depth. But I think what we see here is this is their topographic oceans. It's so outlandish, you know. Where do they go from here? They try and take an orchestra out on the road with them, and they spend all their money and bankrupt themselves. That's what we're going with this. At number 8, we have Power and the Glory by Gentle Giant. I'm a huge Gentle Giant fan. Power and the Glory is right again where they're at their peak. I feel that Gentle Giant, once they made the second album, The Quarry of Taste, they do a run where every album's a masterpiece and every album is as good as the other album. This album, Power and the Glory, is a little bit tighter than what's gone before. Things like Proclamation are a little bit more accessible than some of the stuff we've seen before. And I think as they go on to albums like Freehand and Interview, they do tighten their sound up. And Power and the Glory, again, I did a show with the Prog Meister Steve Gould where we went through Gentle Giant's albums, trying to work out which one's the best one. Power and the Glory is another masterpiece. It's incredible. It's got John Weathers on drums, which I think is the sort of the missing piece in the jigsaw, to quote another Gentle Giant album. And his ability, if you listen to Proclamation, his ability to just, you know, plough that straight line through these incredible compositions is really what makes the sound of Gentle Giant. It's an absolutely incredible album. What can you say about it? It's as great as all the other ones. Not my favourite Gentle Giant album, but it's a wonderful album. And so what have I got at number 7? I have Apostrophe by Frank Zappa. Okay, so Zappa, 1971-72, I can't remember the exact year. Some idiot pushed him off a stage. He breaks his legs or back or whatever it is. He's out of action. He makes all of these incredible sort of big band jazz fusion albums like Waka Jawaka and Gran Wazoo. Once he's recuperated, he puts a band together with George Duke on keyboards, Ralph Humphrey on drums, Ruth Underwood on percussion, Tom Fowler on bass, Napoleon Murphy Brock on vocals and saxophone. If I missed anybody out, of course Frank on guitar and vocals. And for many people, this is the greatest band he ever put together. And he does a run of albums that are absolutely brilliant. Starting with in 73 Overnight Sensation, and then following it up with this album Apostrophe in 1974. He also brings another album out in 1974 that we're going to be talking about in a bit, which is higher up on the list. Apostrophe for me is really the centerpiece for it is Don't Eat the Yellow Snow. which is this sort of almost like Zappa's take on progressive rock. It's a sort of conceptual piece about a fur trapper that's gone up to sort of murder a little seal, and he meets Nanook, the Eskimo. It's completely preposterous, and they end up going and doing all sorts of things I don't want to get into with Father Oblivion. It's a sweet-like piece. It's incredibly composed. I feel that and this never gets mentioned, the bringing in of Ralph Humphrey, who had previously been in Don Ellis's band, his ability to play these incredible charts so easily enabled Zappa to sort of suddenly jump through these pyrotechnic hoops, which he hadn't been able to before. And I also think there's the influence of a lot of jazz rock on this album, and there's a funkiness there, and there's a sort of drive that you can feel is coming from the Mahavishnu. It's a brilliant album. It's the actual track Apostrophe is a jam between him and Jack Bruce and Jim Gordon. Jim Gordon's, of course, is the drummer that was possibly one of the biggest session drummers of the early 70s, before sort of going insane and killing his mom, and then ended up in sort of sidetrack care or prison, whatever, until last year where he passed away. A really sad story, and it's interesting to hear Jim Gordon and Frank and Jack Bruce jamming on that track, and that track always has given this album a different sound to Overnight Sensation. Incredible album. Right, what have we got at number 6? We have Relayer by Yes. Now, when I did this list, this was number 1. I thought, what's the best progressive rock album in 1974? Well, it's Relayer, isn't it? And I wrote it down, Relayer. And then as I started to think about it, it started to drop down the list, right? And I know there's going to be prog fans getting all annoyed and saying Relayer should be number 1. It is an incredible album. We're up against some masterpiece albums. But again, what we hear here is Yes have reached their mountain peak with Tales from Topographic Oceans. Now, up until that point, the thing that's been Yes's calling card is this sort of symphonic, classically influenced structural beauty. You know, they are really exploring how to create long-form compositions with a rock band. And there's a coherence that comes from that compositional process. You hear it on Close to the Edge, and you hear it on Tales of Topographic Oceans, but it's spread over 4 sides, and it's because you get that spread out. It starts in some places to get a little bit trudgy for me. By 1974, again, this is another progressive rock band who's heard the Mahavishnu. They've actually toured with the Mahavishnu, and suddenly they go all jazz rock. And we start to hear loads of soloing, and it becomes chaotic. Gates of Delirium is different to Closer to the Edge in that it's all over the place. It's for me, Gates of Delirium has always been like a tone poem to war, almost. That's how it sounds to me, that we build up to this battle, and once we're in the middle of the battle, it's pure chaos. And once the battle's over, and the dead are lying there, we feel the sun comes up. And I have always loved this. This is, for me, is a greater epic than Close to the Edge. But I know, in terms of sort of compositional brilliance, it's a different beast. Now, this is where the Yes fans will hate me. I love Gates of Delirium, but I prefer the live version of Yes shows. Okay, because that was the first one I heard, and to hear them playing it live, and then when I heard the studio one, it was all a little bit softer around the edges. Can't explain it. The tracks on side 2 never really did it for me. Sound Chaser's good; it's really great. And then is it To Be Over? That goes on forever. I don't know. I know people are going to say they love it. I don't know what to say. Relayer for me is a little bit chaotic. It's a little bit all over the place. They've definitely assimilated Alan White, and there's a new Yes sound there. I think when they pull that in, and in 77 they come back with Going for the One after taking a break from this to do all their solo albums. I think I'm Going for the One. They really arrive at something quite incredible. and I might do a whole video on Going for the One, because it's rapidly, for me, becoming the greatest Yes album. Even though I put Close to Edge at the number 1 on my progressive rock greatest albums list, I'm starting to think that Going for the One is their peak. And this is really interesting because Yes do, of all the bands, overreach themselves. By 1974, they're churning out, yet another album with only 3 tracks on, with a sidelong epic, which is even more chaotic and more all over the place than Close to the Edge. But they start to pull their sound in while retaining the whole outlandish, yes, beautiful, ethereal, away with the fairies sound. But that is unaligned towards what they're going to do in the 1980s, which is produce another incredible album, which is 90125. And that journey, I think that journey towards that, the story of that gets skewed by this idea that punk comes out and changes everything. I don't think it does. I think there's something else going on, and I need to get to it. And I think that's why I'm stumbling here a little bit. We talked about Relayer. Relayer is it's like an anomaly. I think if we swap the covers, I think if Going for the One had the Relayer album cover, and we swapped them around, and you had the bare bottom on Relayer, I think we would be saying that Going for the One is the greatest progressive rock album of all time, because Relayer definitely has perhaps the greatest progressive rock cover of all time. I don't want to spend hours talking about this, so I'm going to move on to number 5, and I have Starless and the Bible Black. Right? King Crimson are going to release 2 albums in 1974. They're both going to be masterpieces, but they're both, again, exploring these cracks that are developing in progressive rock. Robert Fripp, more than anybody else, knows that they're there. And with this iteration of King Crimson, with Bill Bruford on drums, Jamie Muir on percussion, Dave Cross on violin, John Wetton on bass, and I think by this album Jamie Muir's departed, but he's very important to the sound and approach of this group. I think Fripp's turned a corner. Again, we hear a lot more improvisation, we hear a lot more sort of jazz rock influences in. It sounds like the Mahavishnu Orchestra to me. By this point, The Great Deceiver sounds like Mahavishnu Orchestra in a way. Robert Fripp has stated that he was deliberately not listening to the Mahavishnu Orchestra because he didn't want to be influenced by them. Well, he was, because it sounds like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Most people who love the dark, turgid, sort of intense sound of that early Mahavishnu Orchestra, really exemplified by Dancer Mayer. And my friend and associate Matt Stevens from Fierce and Dead is obsessed with the riff from Dancer Mayer. The only other band I think for him that is equal to that in terms of sound and texture is this version of King Crimson. Starless and the Bible Black is quite chaotic as an album. Compositionally, there's a lot of improvisation on there. There's 2 approaches that we hear in this version of King Crimson. There's the sort of still proggy compositional approach that we hear on Locks, Tongues and Aspic, and then there's the sort of Red, which has really become so concise and is almost like the blueprint for progressive metal, and almost the blueprint of heavy metal, really, in a way. This Stars of the Bible Black is the album where it's been culled from live recordings in the same way as Frank Zappa would. So we hear a lot of improvisation on that here. For me, I can't get enough of that, but I think for some people this is a little bit more chaotic. It doesn't have the beauty and concision of Red, which of course we're going to hear later on this list. So that's what I've got. Number 5, it starts with the Bible Black. At number 4, I have Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now this was my number 2 on the list. I originally had Relay at number 1, and then I think the next one's going to be Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is a masterpiece for me. Some people say that side 4 drags a little bit. I've never felt that, to be honest. I think as a kid I sat there trying to follow this story through, and the sort of surreality and Americanizations that it goes into, it sort of takes on America from a very sort of English absurdist Edward Lear. It's almost like Alice in Wonderland, but in New York. That rabbit hole that Rail goes down seems to get even more and more confusing, and there's these sort of Freudian influences. I think it's an incredible album, and I never felt that side 4 drags for me. Whereas I did think that about Tales from Topographic Oceans. I think the only problem with this album is that Peter Gabriel is opening up a new sound, and I'm pretty sure that's why he leaves. He is you could hear it in his voice. He's influenced by R&B, by soul. It's like he's influenced by the American idea of pop music, and he wants to explore that. And I'm sure that approach, he had to get out the band to do that, because what we see on the follow-up album is almost a return to a certain sound that we associate with Genesis. I think the reason why people really have a problem with this album is it's not very Genesis-y. And if I want a dose of that sort of quirky Englishness, then I'm going to go to Nursery Crime. That's my favourite Genesis album. Lamb Lies Down, I love just as much. It's just different. Again, 1974, they are overreaching themselves. All these progressive rock bands have pushed it too far out at this point. And if they'd have had maybe the guts to release an album with 3 sides, long, maybe, with a blank side on the other side, maybe this would be the greatest progressive rock album ever made. I don't know. I absolutely love it. All these albums on this list I love, obviously, but I have to rank them, and that's what I've got at number 4. At number 3, I have Roxy and Elsewhere by Frank Zappa, which is a live album. It's a double album. It's the band that I described before with George Dukin, but we've got the addition of Chester Thompson on drums, which was a factor that confused Ralph Humphrey. I interviewed Ralph Humphrey just before he died, and he discussed this in detail. You know, that turning up to rehearsal, seeing Chester Thompson there, confusing. I'm pretty sure what was going on was Billy Cobham. Frank Zappa had heard Billy Cobham, and he wanted that sound, and the only way to do it was with 2 drummers, maybe. I also think he wanted a groove that Chester had, although Ralph grooves. It's a very. I've thought about this a lot. Why Zappa went for 2 drummers at that point. I don't think it's because any drummer was lacking something. I believe it's compositionally he wanted the percussion heavy sound of 2 drummers, right? He never orchestrated them. He never said you play this and you don't play, you know, in the same way as James Brown did when he had 2 drummers. I've got that guy to do those grooves, I've got that guy to do those grooves. It's not like that. They're always playing at the same time, and that sound then gets grabbed by Genesis, doesn't it? And they actually go and grab Chester Thompson, and live, you know, when we listen to Seconds Out, that sound comes directly from this album, from Roxy and Elsewhere. We don't get it on any of the other albums. It's just on this album. And this album is live, but at certain points Zappa has overdubbed into it. It's an approach that goes right back, I think, to possibly Uncle Meat. You know, he's recording every single gig, and he's capturing certain moments, and he's going in and tightening them up with sort of overdubs. That approach really works, and on things like cheapness, it's jaw-dropping. On tracks like Bebop Tango, you get the polar opposite. You get the feeling of a band that's playing live and have gone off the end of the pier and are just making up as they go along, and it's a live event, and that's very exciting. Roxy and Elsewhere is one of Zappa's greatest albums. I don't perceive it as a studio live album. I perceive it as one of the great albums by this classic Zappa group. So that's what I got at number 3. At number 2, utter masterpiece, could have been number one. I think if I was really being honest with myself, this would be number one. It's You by Gong, which is the third album in the Flying Teapot trilogy, which is one of the most outlandish achievements of progressive rock. 3 albums made over 3 years, which tell the strange story of the sort of psychedelic influences of, you know, aliens, pothead pixies landing on planet Earth. It's whimsical, it's funny, but by this album again, Gong have got to that. This is their mountain peak. From this point, Gong is not just going to go over the mountain peak, but it's going to split all the elements that they've explored. The jazz fusion will go down one thing, the sort of punky, sort of Hawkwindy type approach will go down another thing. The sort of full-on prog will go down another thing. It's going to shatter. At this point, Gong becomes an idea. It becomes a spirit. And if you go to Carvers Tarabi's version of Gong now, which doesn't contain any of the original members, it's Gong in that it's a spirit that is created by David Allen and is personified for me more than anywhere else in this album, You. And this is where we get a sound that we can then track right through to sort of dance music in the late 80s, early 90s, that whole thing of the English take on house music, whereas rather than being sort of a nightclub, you know, gay culture thing that it was in America, here it becomes this sort of pastoral, living off the land, you know, ley lines and worshipping the sort of pagan spirits of the forest. All that thing has its roots on this album. This is probably, in terms of legacy, it is probably the second most important album on this list. It's probably equal to the album I've got at number one, which is of course Red by King Crimson. And as I said before, Robert Fripp has seen the cracks, and he's moved progressive rock from being a sort of whimsical English a whimsical English fusion of post-Beatles rock music with a bit of Jimi Hendrix and Cream and a sort of English ethereal classical approach which goes back to sort of the romantic composers. That's the best way I can explain what progressive rock was. King Crimson at this point goes dark and heavy. Okay, 1974, Red. And on this album, it's absolute perfection. Every track is a masterpiece for me, and there's a concision to side one which you don't hear in King Crimson before, which really anticipates for me what we're going to hear in metal in the late 80s, early 90s, bands like Soundgarden and Nirvana. But also I hear the line that is now going to be picked up by Rainbow Rising, that album, and then Rush, and it's the beginnings of progressive metal for me. So that's what I got at number one. I'm at the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed my little sojourn through all these albums. They're going to be 50 years old this year. Can you believe that we're still talking about these albums now? Right, and you can still put these albums out and be blown away. And isn't it true? There's nobody making albums like this nowadays. These are something special, and I really enjoy being able to come on here and talk about it to people who know. You know, once we're all dead and gone, it will all be forgotten, except maybe my little videos will still be on YouTube. And some inquisitive kids might go, what's this old bloke talking about? He's talking about this album, and maybe they'll still be on Spotify. Who knows? How long will it all last? I don't know. But it's lasted 50 years and we've celebrated it here. If you like this video, like it. If you want to see some more, subscribe. If you want to support me, you can go to Patreon, where there's a whole host. It's not just extra content. There's all sorts of stuff going off over there. And if you don't want to support me by becoming a patron, but you do want to support me financially, which I am very grateful for, and this year is going to be essential for the running of this channel, believe me, you can put some money in my PayPal tip jar. 2024 is going to be the year of this channel. I tell you now. we're going somewhere with this, and I've got ideas, and my ideas are fundamentally to keep this music alive and get the music out there. So if you want to be on that journey with me, you know, just keep in touch. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.